Goodness me, what are these? Could this be a gun?
Yeah, you see the gun there.
One of the barrels?
It's up.
Look at this, look at this. I think we found something here.
Yeah.
This is what happened when the Bismarck shipwreck was searched by an underwater drone descending nearly 3 miles into the North Atlantic and forced historians to reconsider what they thought they knew about the battleship Bismarck. Not where it sank, and not when, but what was still happening around it long after the war ended. The descent that changed the story. When the Bismarck disappeared beneath the surface on May 27, 1941, the ocean closed over the event and erased the final moments from view. For decades, everything that followed was built on surface observations, survivor testimony, and wartime reports written under pressure. The wreck itself remained untouched, sealed beneath 4,791 meters of water, beyond the reach of divers and conventional tools. What lay below was assumed to be settled history. That assumption ended when deep-sea exploration technology finally caught up with the depth required to reach the wreck intact. The drone sent down was not a manned submersible and not an early camera sled. It was a modern, remotely operated vehicle designed to function in the Hadal zone, where pressure exceeds 6,000 pounds per square inch and temperatures hover just above freezing. Its purpose was not dramatic. It was sent to document structural condition, corrosion patterns, and long-term decay. The expectation was confirmation, not revelation. As the drone descended, its cameras recorded a world without reference points. No light, no movement, only suspended particles drifting through the water column. Hours passed before the seabed appeared. Then the shape emerged. The bow stood upright, its massive form resting on a gentle slope shaped by ancient volcanic activity. The hull was intact in a way that immediately contradicted long-standing assumptions. There was no debris field stretching for miles, no scattered remains suggesting violent disintegration on impact. The ship had arrived on the seafloor largely as a single structure. As the drone moved closer, details sharpened. The name on the bow was still readable. The armored belt remained continuous. Turrets rested where they had fallen silent, their barrels angled but not torn away. This was not what a ship destroyed purely by overwhelming force was expected to look like after a fall of nearly 3 miles. The drone's sensors began mapping the wreck in segments, scanning plate thickness, deformation, and compartment boundaries. What emerged from that data was unsettling in its restraint. Damage was concentrated above the waterline, consistent with surface bombardment. Below it, the structure showed continuity. The systems designed to keep the ship alive longest had done exactly that. The drone did not uncover a dramatic explosion site or a single fatal wound. Instead, it revealed a ship that had stopped fighting long before it stopped floating. A vessel that entered the deep not as debris, but as a controlled mass surrendering to gravity. That realization shifted the mission. The drone was no longer documenting a wreck. It was examining a decision that had been sealed underwater for more than 80 years, waiting for technology capable of seeing it clearly. The parts that should not have survived. As the underwater drone continued its survey, it moved away from the bow and into areas of the wreck that earlier expeditions could not examine in detail. This was where expectations began to fail quietly. Naval engineers had long assumed that the Bismarck, after being battered by artillery and torpedoes, would show signs of catastrophic collapse once it began its descent. At extreme depth, unsupported structures normally fold inward, compartments implode, and internal layouts are erased. What the drone found instead suggested a very different sequence of events. The stern section lay separated from the main hull, torn away during the fall rather than during combat. The fracture edges showed stress consistent with hydrodynamic forces, not explosive damage. This meant the ship had remained structurally unified long enough for gravity and water resistance to pull it apart during descent, not before. Ships destroyed violently at the surface typically arrive fragmented. The Bismarck did not. As the drone traced the break line, its cameras revealed compressed decks stacked tightly together, like pages pressed flat rather than blown outward. Bulkheads were bent inward uniformly, showing pressure acting slowly and evenly. This pattern is associated with controlled flooding, not sudden rupture. It suggested the ship entered the water already compromised internally, allowing pressure to equalize as it sank instead of tearing the structure apart. The drone then moved along the midsection, where the ship's most protected spaces had been located. These areas were expected to show signs of collapse first, given their depth and enclosed design. Instead, many compartments retained recognizable boundaries. Hatches remained closed. Internal walls were distorted, but not shredded. The arrangement implied that water entered in stages, not all at once. Sensors recorded deformation patterns that raised further questions. Certain internal spaces appeared to have flooded earlier than surrounding areas, while others remained sealed longer. This staggered sequence contradicted the idea of uncontrolled sinking. It pointed to selective pathways for water movement, governed by valves, doors, and compartment isolation systems designed into the ship from the beginning. What the drone did not find was just as important. There was no evidence of an internal explosion. No outward blown plating, no collapsed magazines. The catastrophic ending, often imagined in surface narratives, was absent from the physical record below. The ship's internal architecture told a quieter story, one of systems failing in order rather than all at once. This forced investigators to reconsider a basic assumption. If the Bismarck had been rendered helpless above the water, but remained structurally coherent below it, then the transition from surface to seabed was not a chaotic plunge. It was a managed collapse, guided by the way the ship was built and the actions taken inside it. The drone's data did not accuse, it did not explain motive. It simply revealed that the wreck behaved as if it had been prepared for the deep, not thrown into it. And that realization shifted attention away from the battle itself toward what happened inside the ship after the fighting had already ended. The silence inside the steel. When the underwater drone adjusted its course and began navigating closer to the interior, ladders remained fixed to bulkheads. Door frames held their shape. In several locations, watertight doors were visibly shut, their locking mechanisms engaged. These were not doors blown closed by force, they were secured. The arrangement mattered. Warships are designed with compartmentalization to limit flooding, but in a ship overwhelmed suddenly, those systems fail unevenly. What the drone observed instead was consistency. Groups of compartments showed similar deformation patterns, suggesting they flooded together, while adjacent sections appeared to resist longer. The drone's lighting revealed another detail that unsettled researchers. In areas where electrical systems should have failed instantly under flooding, fixtures remained in place rather than torn free. Conduits followed expected routes. Panels were damaged, but not violently stripped away. The internal environment looked less like the aftermath of an explosion and more like the remains of a system powered down in stages. These observations aligned with something long debated, but never visible until now. Survivor accounts had described controlled actions taken after combat ended. Valves opened, machinery disabled, spaces isolated. For decades, those statements existed without physical confirmation. The wreck now showed traces consistent with deliberate internal management rather than total collapse. The drone did not find signs of panic frozen in metal. It found order pressed into distortion. That distinction reframed the final hours of the Bismarck. The ship did not simply fail, it transitioned. Control had already been lost at the surface, but below deck, control over systems still existed, if only briefly. As the drone pulled back and widened its scan, one conclusion became unavoidable. The ship that entered the deep did so after a sequence of internal choices had already reshaped it. The wreck was not only a consequence of battle, it was the outcome of actions taken when the battle no longer mattered. That realization deepened the silence surrounding the Bismarck. The ocean had not erased the final moments. It had preserved them just enough to suggest intent without explaining it. And with that, the drone's mission moved from observation to interpretation, carrying forward a question that steel alone could not answer. A discovery that did not settle the question. The first time the Bismarck was found, it was supposed to close the case. In 1989, an expedition led by Dr. Robert Ballard reached the wreck after decades of uncertainty about its location. The technology used at the time was advanced for its era, yet limited by comparison to modern systems. Cameras provided sweeping views, sonar traced outlines, and the ship's resting place was finally confirmed. History expected resolution. What it received instead was contradiction. Battleships lost under overwhelming fire often arrive in pieces, their remains spread by violent breakup or uneven flooding. The Bismarck had not done that. It had traveled downward as a single mass before parts of it failed under stress. That failure occurred during descent, not at the surface. The damage pattern did not point to one fatal blow. It suggested accumulation without collapse. This forced a reconsideration of how the ship crossed from surface combat to underwater rest. What troubled investigators was not what was visible, but what was missing. There was no evidence of a massive internal detonation, no torn open magazines, no outward burst plating beneath the waterline. The ship had been silenced above the surface, but below it, the structure retained coherence longer than anticipated. That coherence implied time. Time implies sequence. Sequence implies decision. Later expeditions returned with improved tools. Cameras grew sharper. Navigation became more precise, yet each revisit reinforced the same problem. The wreck confirmed damage without clarifying cause. It supported both the record of intense bombardment and the accounts of internal action. It did not choose between them. This was where the underwater drone altered the conversation. Unlike earlier surveys that focused on location and identification, the drone's mission centered on behavior, how the ship failed, how water moved through it, how stress reshaped steel. The drone did not search for a verdict, it searched for patterns. Those patterns refused to align neatly with a single explanation. The ship had been battered into silence, yet its descent followed rules more orderly than expected. That order suggested that the final chapter of the Bismarck was not written by explosions alone. It exposed something more unsettling. The wreck showed that the end of the Bismarck was not a moment, but a process. And processes leave room for intention, even when the people involved are long gone. When technology began asking questions. As underwater drone technology advanced, the focus of exploration shifted from finding the Bismarck to understanding it. The damage was extensive, but it was not random. The superstructure bore the unmistakable marks of concentrated naval bombardment. Fire control towers were gone, gun housings were fractured, upper decks showed collapse consistent with sustained shell fire. None of that was unexpected. What followed was. Unlike earlier expeditions that relied on broad imagery and sonar outlines, these drones were equipped to interrogate the wreck as a system. They mapped electrical pathways, tracked corrosion behavior, and compared material decay across different sections of the hull. Instead of treating the ship as a single object, the technology examined it as a collection of environments that had aged differently for more than 80 years. That difference became impossible to ignore. Certain areas of the wreck showed corrosion patterns consistent with complete exposure to seawater since 1941. Steel there had thinned evenly, surfaces roughened, and edges softened by time. Other areas told a different story. Metal remained comparatively intact. Corrosion advanced more slowly. In some sections, decay appeared delayed, as if seawater had arrived later or under controlled conditions. The drone's data flagged these discrepancies repeatedly, forcing analysts to stop treating the wreck as uniform. The questions multiplied when sensors began comparing internal and external decay rates. In a ship that failed catastrophically, internal and external environments usually equalize rapidly. The Bismarck did not reflect that pattern. Some internal spaces showed chemical signatures, indicating prolonged isolation before exposure. This did not point to strength alone. It pointed to separation. What it revealed was absence. The absence of random failure, the absence of uniform decay, the absence of evidence that the ship's interior had been fully exposed at the same moment as its exterior. These absences mattered more than any single object could have. Drone operators also began to notice how the wreck interacted with its surroundings. Sediment accumulation differed sharply along the hull. Fine particles settled evenly in some areas, while others remained comparatively clear, suggesting differences in water flow long after the ship reached the seabed. That implied that internal voids and sealed volumes continued influencing how water moved around the structure years after sinking. Technology had reached a point where it no longer needed to speculate about intent. It could identify consequences. Those consequences suggested that the Bismarck entered the deep, with parts of itself still behaving as isolated systems rather than as a fully open wreck. This reframed the mystery. The question became why the ship's internal architecture continued to matter after the war had already claimed it, why some spaces aged differently, why separation endured. Technology did not uncover a hidden secret carved into steel. It revealed something subtler and harder to dismiss: what the ocean chose to keep. Nearly 3 miles beneath the surface, the wreck rests in permanent darkness, untouched by currents strong enough to disturb it and sealed off from any intervention that might force answers. The ocean preserved the ship in a way that allows disagreement to survive. Modern surveys show a wreck that resists final interpretation. The hull remains largely coherent. The armored core is still identifiable. The ship's orientation on the seabed suggests balance rather than collapse. Nothing about its resting position suggests panic or chaos at the moment it arrived. It settled into the seafloor as a structure that had already finished changing by the time gravity took over. This is why the Bismarck continues to divide historians. The physical evidence supports multiple conclusions without confirming any one of them completely. The bombardment was overwhelming. The loss of steering made survival impossible. Yet the wreck itself reflects restraint, not rupture. It carries the imprint of systems doing exactly what they were designed to do under terminal conditions. The underwater drone did not find a moment of failure. It found a sequence. A ship that lost command, then combat function, then buoyancy. Each stage left its mark in steel. The final descent was not sudden. It was the last step in a process already underway, one that unfolded beyond the view of those watching from the surface. What makes this unsettling is not the idea that the ship sank. That was inevitable. What remains unresolved is who controlled the timing of that inevitability. The wreck does not show a single wound that demanded immediate surrender to the sea. It shows a vessel that crossed a threshold where choice narrowed but did not disappear instantly. The ocean has preserved that ambiguity. Pressure flattened decks and bent bulkheads, but it did not erase sequence. Darkness concealed details, but it protected structure. The Bismarck did not become debris. It became a record written in deformation rather than words. The underwater drone eventually withdrew, its lights fading as it climbed back toward the surface. Nothing followed it. No signal, no movement. The ship remained as it has for decades, unchanged by observation. The technology that reached it did not awaken the wreck or settle its arguments. It only confirmed that the final chapter was not chaotic enough to be simple. The Bismarck was built to endure isolation, pressure, and overwhelming force. In the end, that design succeeded in an unexpected way. The ship did not just survive longer than expected during battle, it survived long enough to carry uncertainty with it into the deep, leaving behind a grave that still refuses to tell the ocean's version of the truth. What ultimately lingers is the imbalance between effort and outcome. Enormous resources were committed to stopping the Bismarck, yet the final state of the wreck suggests a conclusion that required very little force at all. The ship now exists as something finished but unresolved, not because evidence is missing, but because it refuses to point in a single direction. The drone's footage does not accuse, explain, or comfort. It simply shows a result that feels deliberate without ever revealing deliberation itself. That tension is what remains for the viewer to carry away. The possibility that some endings are not dramatic, not violent, and not clearly decided, but arrive quietly while everyone involved believes the decision has already been made elsewhere. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting below the surface. On this channel, we examine the moments history closed too quickly and the evidence that still refuses to settle. Subscribe now and explore the other documentaries on the channel to continue uncovering what time, distance, and silence were never meant to hide.